The spring air of Milford, a small town in Ohio, was filled with the smell of lilacs. Kate Miller walked slowly down the sidewalk, tired after a 12-hour shift at Jerry's Cafe. Her legs were buzzing and her eyes were sleepy from fatigue. She dreamed of one thing only: to collapse into her bed and sleep until noon. The night shifts were exhausting, but they paid better, and Kate was saving up to open her own cafe. Their 2-story house with a white picket fence was no different from the other houses on Maple Street. Kate noticed the garage door was ajar. That was odd. She distinctly remembered closing it before she left for work. Her mom was always concerned about safety, especially when her father was away. Her heart sped up when she spotted Brian's familiar dark blue Ford parked a little farther down the street. What was her boyfriend doing here so early? They hadn't made an appointment. Kate pushed open the garage door. It was dark inside, with only a thin beam of light coming through the small window under the ceiling. "Brian!" she called out, fumbling for the light switch on the wall. Light flooded the room, and Kate froze. In the corner of the garage, near her father's old tools, Brian lay on the floor, the unnatural pose, the blood spreading across the concrete floor. Her eyes widened with horror when she noticed a wrench next to his head, stained in something dark. "Brian!" A scream escaped her throat as she rushed to the motionless body. Kneeling down, she touched his neck looking for a pulse. The skin was cold. Nothing. Not a single beat. With trembling hands, Kate pulled out her cell phone and dialed 9111. "911, what's your emergency?" came a calm female voice. "Help, please!" Kate's voice trailed off. "My boyfriend. He's dead. In our garage. Someone hit him." The next minutes blended into a blur. The operator said something about not touching anything, waiting for the police, and getting out of the garage. Kate didn't remember following those instructions. She was sitting on the porch with her arms wrapped around her knees when the police sirens cut through the morning silence of Maple Street. Lisa Miller was in the kitchen making breakfast when she heard her daughter scream. Running out into the yard, she saw Kate sitting on the porch steps, sobbing. "Oh my God, Kate, what's wrong?" Kate lifted her crying face. "Mom, Brian, he's out there, in the garage." Lisa rushed toward the garage, but was stopped by a policeman who had just gotten out of his patrol car. "Ma'am, please don't go in there. It's a crime scene." 2 police cars and an ambulance parked in front of the house, attracting the attention of neighbors who began looking out of windows and onto the porch. Detective John Parker arrived 15 minutes later. A tall man with graying temples and attentive brown eyes. He was known in Milford as the man who knew everyone and everything. He'd been on the force for 20 years and had seen a lot of deaths, but he'd never gotten used to them. "Good morning, Mrs. Miller," he said as he approached the house. "I'm very sorry about what happened. May I ask you a few questions?" Lisa nodded, her hands shaking as she hugged her crying daughter. "When was the last time you saw Brian Foster?" Lisa swallowed. "I didn't see him yesterday. He didn't come by to see us. Kate was at work from 3 in the afternoon until 3 in the morning. I went to bed around 10. The detective nodded, making notes in his notebook. "And you didn't hear any unusual noises during the night? Maybe a car or voices in the yard?" Lisa shook her head. "No, I'm a sound sleeper, especially when Tom is away." "Tom is?" "My husband. He's a truck driver on a trip to Chicago right now. Should be back tomorrow." Detective Parker beckoned to an officer. "Get in touch with Mr. Miller. Report what happened." He then turned to Kate. "Miss Miller, I need you to tell me what happened this morning." Kate wiped away her tears and began to recount in a shaky voice. About coming home from work, seeing Brian's car, finding him in the garage. "We didn't arrange to meet. I don't know what he was doing here so early," she finished, crying again. The medical examiner who arrived on the scene confirmed what Detective Parker already knew. The young man had died from head trauma caused by a heavy object. The preliminary time of death was between 11 o'clock in the evening and 2 o'clock in the morning. Detective Parker took a close look around the garage. The overturned toolbox, the scattered items, the signs of a struggle were obvious. The murder weapon, a heavy wrench, lay next to the body, and there were traces of blood and the victim's hair. "Detective!" CSI called out, examining the pockets of Brian's jacket, which hung on a hook by the entrance. "Victim's cell phone!" Parker picked up the gloved smartphone and turned on the screen. 27 missed calls from a number not listed in contacts. The last call was at 10 hours and 32 minutes past midnight. Interesting, the detective muttered, handing the phone to the technician. Check this number. As he exited the garage, Detective Parker noticed Ed Thompson, a neighbor of the Millers, standing by the fence, watching curiously. "Mr. Thompson," the detective beckoned to him. "Did you notice anything unusual last night?" Ed scratched the back of his head. "Well, I saw this guy Brian's car around 9 o'clock at night. Thought he drove over to Kate's place, but she was at work, right?" "Yeah, she was at work from 3 to 3, Parker confirmed. "Are you sure you saw his car at 9? "Absolutely. I was taking out the trash and noticed his blue Ford. He's so conspicuous with those stickers on the back window." The detective turned back to Lisa, who was sitting on the porch, hugging Kate. Mrs. Miller, Mr. Thompson says he saw Brian's car outside your house around 9 o'clock last night. Are you sure you didn't see him?" Lisa turned pale. I must not have noticed. I was watching TV, then I took a sleeping pill and went to bed. Maybe he came to see Kate without knowing she was at work? Maybe, the detective stretched out, keeping his eyes on Lisa. "Did Brian have a key to your house or garage?" "No," Kate replied. "We've only been dating for 6 months. I didn't give him a key." At that moment, an officer approached the detective. "Sir, we've contacted Tom Miller. He's been on the road all night. His whereabouts are confirmed by the truck's GPS and receipts from roadside cafes. He's on his way back." Parker nodded and turned to the technician examining Brian's belongings. "Anything else?" The technician held up the victim's jacket. "Detective, you need to see this." He pointed to the lining of the jacket where a small pocket had been neatly stitched in. In it was a second cell phone, an older model, no frills, no buttons. "Looks like our victim had secrets," Detective Parker said thoughtfully, picking up the find. Kate and Lisa looked at each other incomprehensibly. "Why would Brian need a second phone?" Kate whispered. Detective Parker stared at the small phone in his hand. One thing he'd learned in his 20 years on the job was that people only get secret phones when they have something to hide, and often those secrets cost them their lives. Hash. Chapter 2, Beneath the Surface, hash. Detective John Parker sat at his desk at Milford Police Station, holding Brian Foster's recovered cell phone. A simple button model, not a smartphone, the kind you usually buy so you can easily throw it away. He turned it on, surprised that the phone wasn't password protected. People always make mistakes, the detective thought as he opened the messages. There was only one caller in the contact list, labeled L. Parker began reading the correspondence, his eyebrows rising higher and higher. The messages were unambiguous, passionate confessions, meeting plans, intimate details, and photos. The detective took a deep breath. He'd seen plenty of cheating in his years of service, but this situation was particularly unpleasant. "Hey, John." Sandy Collins, a technician with the Milford Police Department, entered the office. Completed a call screening on the victim's cell phone. All 27 missed calls came from a prepaid phone. No data left behind at purchase. Activated for cash at Walgreens supermarket on Main Street 3 weeks ago. "Call Walgreens and have them check the security footage from that day," Parker asked. "Already did. Waiting to hear back." Sandy noticed the second phone on the table. "Is it something interesting?" "Possibly a clue." Parker held out the phone to her. "Check everything you can, especially interested in who's hiding under the initial L." "L," Sandy repeated. "A name with the letter L. Is there anyone by that name in the file?" "Lisa Miller," the detective said quietly. "The victim's girlfriend's mother." Sandy whistled. "Now that's a twist. It's only a guess so far." Parker rubbed his eyes. "We need proof. Also check Lisa and Tom Miller's bank statements for the last 3 months. I need to know about any unusual transactions." When Sandy left, the detective went back to studying the case files. He looked through the crime scene photos, thinking about motive. If there was indeed a connection between Lisa Miller and Brian Foster, a love triangle could lead to murder. But who exactly had struck the blow? The phone rang, interrupting his musings. "Detective Parker." "John, it's Mike from the lab. We've got the preliminary forensics results. The wrench has only the victim's and Tom Miller's prints on it, which makes sense since the tool belongs to him. However, there are traces of cloth on the handle, presumably from gloves. The killer was smart enough not to leave prints. I see. And the time of death? Between 10 and 11 in the evening. It's hard to be more specific than that. Thanks, Mike. Keep me posted. Parker hung up the phone and took a deep breath. He now had a rough time frame. If Brian had been killed between 10 and 11, then Kate, who worked at the cafe, had an alibi. Lisa Miller, on the other hand, was home alone. There was a knock on the door and Sandy looked in. I have information on the Millers' bank statements. 3 days ago, Lisa Miller withdrew $5,000 in cash from an account she and her husband shared. That's the largest amount she's ever withdrawn. 5,000, Parker repeated. The day before the murder. Interesting. Was this money found in the house? No such sums were found in the examination. Then we must find out where that money went. Parker rose from the table. I'll go to the Millers again. We need to take another look at the garage and talk to Kate. The Millers' house on Maple Street was surrounded by police tape. There was an officer on duty at the entrance who nodded to the detective. In the yard, Parker spotted Tom Miller's pickup truck. The father of the family had returned from a road trip. The door was opened by Tom, a stout man with tired eyes and a gaunt face. Detective Parker. Tom shook his hand. Come on in. We're all in shock over what happened. In the living room, Lisa sat on the couch with her arms wrapped around herself. Next to her was Kate, pale, with eyes reddened with tears. Good afternoon. The detective said hello. I'm sorry to have to bother you at a time like this, but I have a few questions. Of course, Tom nodded, sitting down next to his wife and putting his arm around her shoulders. We want you to find whoever did this to Brian. Mrs. Miller. Parker looked at Lisa carefully. You said you didn't see Brian the evening before the murder, but your neighbor claims his car was parked outside your house around 9 o'clock. Lisa nervously interlocked her fingers. I already told you I took sleeping pills and went to bed early. I didn't hear anyone coming. You didn't hear a bell or a knock on the door? No, nothing. Was the garage door locked? I think so, yes. I always lock the doors when Tom's away. Parker made a note in his notebook. Mrs. Miller, 3 days ago you withdrew $5,000 in cash from your account. May I ask what that money was spent on? Tom looked at his wife in surprise. 5,000? Lisa, you didn't tell me anything about that. Lisa turned pale. It's for the kitchen remodeling. We talked about it, remember? I was planning on meeting with the contractor next week. Where's that money now? The detective asked. In my closet, in a shoebox, mumbled Lisa. Do you mind if we check it out? Sure. Lisa stood up to escort the detective out, but Parker stopped her. Officer Jenkins can go with you, Mrs. Miller, and I'd like to talk to Kate alone. When Lisa and the officer had gone upstairs and Tom had gone into the kitchen to make coffee, the detective sat down across from Kate. Kate, I know this is hard for you right now, but I need your help to find Brian's killer. The girl nodded, wiping away her tears. I understand. Have you noticed anything unusual in Brian's behavior lately? Kate thought. Yeah, to be honest, he's been kind of distant, often canceling our meetings. He said he had a part-time job, but he didn't specify what kind of job he had. He showed me a new watch about 2 weeks ago, an expensive one I'd seen in a store that cost about $1,000. He said it was a bonus at work, but I didn't believe him. They don't give bonuses like that at the machine shop. Did Brian have money problems? Yeah, he was always living from paycheck to paycheck. Said he wanted to open his own shop, but he didn't have enough startup capital. Parker nodded. Did Brian have any other girlfriends before you? I don't know, I guess. Kate frowned. What does that have to do with his murder? I'm not sure yet. Just trying to get a complete picture. The detective paused. Kate, did Brian ever show any interest in your mom? What? The girl recoiled. No, what kind of question is that? I'm sorry, but I have to consider every possible theory, Parker said softly. Have you noticed any oddities in Mom's behavior in recent weeks? Kate fell silent, remembering. I don't know. Maybe she's gotten more jumpy, snapping at nothing more often. But I thought it was because Dad's away a lot. It's always hard for her when she's alone. At that moment, Lisa and Officer Jenkins returned. Detective, Jenkins addressed Parker. Only $800 was found at the location indicated. Tom, who had returned from the kitchen with cups of coffee, stared at his wife. "Lisa, where's the rest of the money?" I spent some of it on groceries and a gift for Kate. It was supposed to be a surprise." $4,200 on groceries and a gift?" Tom asked incredulously. Lisa burst into tears. "I don't remember. I've been under so much stress lately." Parker decided to change the subject. "Mr. Miller, with your permission, I'd like to take another look around the garage." "Of course," Tom nodded, still looking at his wife, perplexed. The detective headed into the garage where the forensics team had already finished their work. He walked slowly around the room, scrutinizing every corner. At the far end of the garage, behind some old boxes, he noticed something red. Putting on gloves, he pulled out a rag soiled in something dark that looked like dried blood. There was a bottle of detergent nearby. "Officer Jenkins," Parker called out, "bag this as evidence and send it to the lab. We need to see if the blood on this rag belongs to Brian Foster." Back at the house, the detective turned to Lisa. "Mrs. Miller, have you cleaned the garage since after the discovery of the body?" "No," Lisa shook her head. "I didn't even go in there." "That's odd, because I just found a rag in there with what looked like blood on it and a bottle of Ajax cleaner. You're the one who usually cleans the house, right?" "Yes, but is that your usual detergent?" "Yes, I use Ajax, but—" "Detective," Tom interjected, "what are you implying?" Parker didn't have time to answer as his cell phone rang. "Parker, yes, Sandy. What? Are you sure? Okay, I'll be right there." He tucked the phone into his pocket and looked at the Miller family. "I need to get back to the station. Some new information has come up." When the detective was already at the door, he was stopped by Ed Thompson, the Miller's neighbor, who was shuffling nervously from foot to foot on the porch. "Detective, may I speak to you?" "Sure, Mr. Thompson." "I didn't know if I should talk about it, but I have a security camera pointed at my backyard. You see, we had some thefts in our neighborhood last year, and I installed the camera. It captures part of the Miller's garage." Parker looked at his neighbor carefully. "Do you have the footage for the night of the murder?" "Yes." Ed held out a flash card to the detective. "There's a tape here from 8 o'clock that night to midnight. I haven't watched it, but there may be something useful in there." "Thank you, Mr. Thompson. It may turn out to be very important." At the police station, Sandy was already waiting for the detective with the news. "John, the technicians have confirmed that Brian Foster's second phone was used exclusively to contact a single caller. They've recovered the deleted messages and photos." She held out printouts to the detective. The pictures captured Brian and Lisa Miller in explicit poses. "Looks like they were having an affair," Sandy said. "Now we need to find out if Kate knew about it," Parker muttered. "And what caused the murder." "There's something else," Sandy added. "I checked the cameras at Walgreens. Guess who bought a prepaid cell phone 3 weeks ago?" She turned the computer screen toward him, which clearly showed Lisa Miller paying for the purchase. "What about the rag from the garage?" Parker asked. "The lab confirms the blood belongs to Brian Foster, and the cloth showed traces of Ajax Remedy, the same one Mrs. Miller uses." The detective inserted the flashcard from the neighbor into the computer and began reviewing the footage. The camera did indeed capture part of the Miller's garage. At 9 o'clock and 20 minutes past 9 p.m., Brian Foster appeared on the tape and cautiously walked to the side door of the garage and knocked. A minute later, the door opened and Brian stepped inside. Parker sped up his browsing. At 10 hours and 5 minutes into the tape, a figure appeared leaving the house and heading toward the garage. It was Lisa Miller in a house robe. She entered the garage and closed the door behind her. For the next 20 minutes, nothing happened. Then, at 10 hours and 27 minutes, the garage door opened again. Lisa Miller stepped out, looking around. Her robe was covered in dark stains. "Bingo," Detective Parker whispered, stopping the tape. Detective John Parker sat across from Lisa Miller in the interview room of the Milford Police Station. A small room with gray walls, a metal table, and 2 chairs. This was where he'd spent hundreds of hours listening to confessions, lies, and attempts to get away with it. In 20 years of service, he had learned to distinguish truth from fiction, to see the fear in the eyes of the guilty and the despair of the innocent. Today, a woman sat before him with slumped shoulders, nervously rubbing the strap of her wristwatch. Lisa Miller was dressed in a tight blouse and skirt, as if she were going to a business meeting, not a murder interrogation. Her blonde hair was neatly styled, but her eyes gave away her sleepless night red with dark circles. "Mrs. Miller, thank you for agreeing to come in," the detective began, spreading out the file folder in front of him. "Did I have a choice?" Lisa asked quietly, looking at her hands. "You're not under arrest, and you have the right to an attorney." "I didn't do anything." Lisa looked up. "Why do I need a lawyer?" Parker didn't answer. Instead, he pulled a photograph out of a folder and placed it in front of Lisa. The picture showed a wrench with traces of blood on it. "Brian Foster's murder weapon," he explained. "Hard blow to the back of the head. Instant death." Lisa looked away. "Why are you showing me this?" "Because I think you know more than you're telling me." The detective pulled another document out of the folder. "This is a printout of your bank transactions. 3 days ago, you withdrew $5,000. We only found $800 in the house. Where did the rest go?" "I've already explained." "No, Mrs. Miller, you lied, and you continue to lie." Parker turned on his laptop and turned the screen toward Lisa. On it was the video from the neighbor's camera. "This is you entering the garage at 10 o'clock, 5 o'clock in the evening, the night of the murder." He pressed pause as Lisa's figure clearly appeared in the frame. "And this is you coming out at 10 o'clock 27 minutes. Notice the stains on your robe." Lisa turned pale, her hands trembling. It's not what you think." "What am I supposed to think, Mrs. Miller?" The detective pulled another item out of the folder, a cell phone sealed in a plastic bag. "This is Brian Foster's second cell phone that we found in his jacket. Do you know what's interesting about it?" Lisa was silent, her breathing quickening. Messages, dozens of messages to a contact labeled L, and pictures, very explicit pictures with a woman who looks exactly like you. The detective spread out printouts of several of the photos. Lisa covered her face with her hands. "Mrs. Miller, we have the security footage from the Walgreens store where you bought the prepaid phone, the same one that made calls to Brian the night he died." A heavy silence filled the room. Lisa lowered her hands and looked at the detective with a look full of despair. "I didn't mean for this to happen," she whispered. "It was a mistake, a terrible mistake." "Tell me what happened," Parker said softly, turning on the recorder. Lisa took a deep breath, as if about to dive into icy water. "It all started 3 months ago. Tom was on a long trip. Almost 2 weeks. Brian came over often, waiting for Kate from work. We got to talking. He was so attentive, interested in my life, my hobbies. I felt young and desirable again." She fell silent, wiping away her tears. "Go on, Mrs. Miller." "It happened on its own. Tom is away all the time. We hardly talk when he's home. I know that's no excuse, but Brian made me feel alive. We started seeing each other when Kate was at work. He suggested we buy separate phones so no one would know." "When did things change?" the detective asked. Lisa clenched her fists. "About a month ago, Brian became different. Started hinting that Kate might find out about us. First just hints, then direct threats. He said he needed money, $5,000 to start his business. I said no. Then he started threatening to tell Tom and Kate everything." "Is that why you withdrew the money 3 days ago?" "Yes," Lisa nodded. "I thought if I paid him, he'd leave us alone. I gave him the money, but he said it wasn't enough. He wanted more, a lot more." "What happened the night of the murder?" "He called, said he was coming over. I begged him not to come, told him I'd get more money, but it took time." Lisa's voice shook. "He arrived around 9, said to meet in the garage so no one would see. I thought I could convince him to wait." She fell silent, staring into the void. "What happened then?" Parker asked insistently. "He was different. Not the caring guy I fell in love with. He laughed, said he was using me, that he was really only interested in money. Said Kate was just a way to get closer to our savings, that he knew about Tom's insurance, about our savings." Lisa sobbed. "He said if I didn't find a way to get $20,000 in a week, he'd tell me everything. Not just about us, but about our pictures that he was going to send to Tom and everyone in Milford. I begged him, but he only laughed. He said I was a pathetic aging woman who was easily fooled." "And that's when you took the wrench?" "I didn't plan it," Lisa exclaimed. "It was standing next to the table. Brian turned to leave, said he was giving me 3 days. I grabbed the key and She covered her face with her hands, her shoulders shaking with sobs. "You hit him over the head," the detective finished. "I didn't mean to kill him, just to stop him, to silence him." He fell, and there was blood spreading around his head. I panicked, tried to stop the bleeding, but it was too late. I found a rag. I tried to wipe it off, but I realized it was useless. I just walked away, hoping no one would find out. Detective Parker turned off the recorder. "Lisa Miller, you're under arrest for the murder of Brian Foster. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. You have the right to an attorney." At that moment, the door of the interrogation room swung open. Kate stood on the threshold, her face contorted with horror and pain. "Kate, what are you doing here?" Lisa exclaimed, jumping up from her chair. "Officer Collins said you were here." Kate's voice shook. "I wanted to be supportive. I thought the detective was at it again with some stupid questions. But is it true? You and Brian?" "Kate, honey, I can explain." "You killed him!" Kate recoiled as Lisa tried to move closer to her. "You slept with my boyfriend and then you killed him! Miss Miller, you shouldn't be here!" Detective Parker tried to lead the girl out of the room, but she pushed his hand away. "I want to hear from her! Tell me the truth, Mom! Tell me it's not true!" Lisa slumped in her chair, her shoulders slumped under the weight of guilt and shame. "I'm sorry, Kate. I didn't mean to hurt you." "Didn't mean to hurt you?" Kate laughed hysterically. "You slept with my boyfriend and then you killed him. How could you?" "He was blackmailing me," Lisa exclaimed. "He used both of us. All he wanted was the money." "And that's why you killed him? You could have told me. You could have gone to the police, but you chose murder." An officer entered the room. "Detective Parker, Mr. Miller is here." A moment later, Tom appeared on the doorstep. His face was pale, his eyes confused. "What's going on?" he asked, shifting his gaze from a crying Kate to a broken Lisa and the serious detective. "Mr. Miller," Parker began, "your wife just confessed to the murder of Brian Foster. She had an affair with him that ended in blackmail and, ultimately, murder." Tom shook as if from a blow. "Lisa, is it true?" Lisa couldn't lift her eyes. "I'm sorry, Tom." There was a heavy silence in the room, broken only by Kate's sobs. Tom looked as if the ground was leaving beneath his feet. 27 years of marriage," he whispered. "For what, Lisa?" "Mr. Miller, Miss Miller." Detective Parker took them gently under the arms. "I think you'd better step outside. Officer Jenkins will take you home, and Mrs. Miller will stay with us." As Tom and Kate walked out, the detective turned to Lisa. "You will be taken to the county jail. There will be a preliminary hearing tomorrow where you will be assigned an attorney if you can't hire your own." Lisa nodded, her eyes blank. "I deserve to be punished. I ruined everything. My family, Kate's life. And I took the life of a man, no matter what kind of man he was." "Blackmail is a serious offense," the detective observed. "And the fact that Brian manipulated you and your daughter will be taken into account by the court." "That doesn't justify murder," Lisa said quietly. "Nothing justifies what I did." 3 hours later, Detective Parker closed Brian Foster's murder case. All the evidence fit together, the confession was recorded, and now justice should have run its course. But, as so often happened in such cases, there was no triumphant feeling, only the bitterness of broken lives and broken relationships. He decided to stop by the Miller's house to make sure Tom and Kate were okay. The house on Maple Street looked subdued, as if it, too, was processing the tragedy that had occurred. Tom opened the door, his face gaunt, as if he'd aged 10 years in one day. "Detective Parker," he nodded. "Come in." In the living room, Kate sat on the couch, wrapping her arms around her knees. She raised tear-reddened eyes as the detective entered. "How are you holding up?" Parker asked, though the answer was obvious. "How are we holding up?" Tom grinned bitterly. "My wife cheated on me with my daughter's boyfriend and then killed him. You don't see that kind of thing on even the wildest TV shows." "I still can't believe it," Kate whispered. "Brian and Mom, it's like a bad dream." "I'm so sorry," the detective said sincerely. "I know no words will help, but it will get easier with time." "You have no idea what it's like," Tom shook his head. 27 years together, raising a daughter, making plans for the future, and it's all ruined. How am I supposed to move on with my life now? Day by day, Parker replied. It'll be unbearably hard at first, then it'll just be hard. Then you'll learn to live with it. And what's going to happen to Mom? Kate asked. Tomorrow's preliminary hearing, given the circumstances, lack of criminal intent, blackmail by the victim, she'll probably be charged with manslaughter. That's 5 to 15 years, depending on the court's decision. Kate nodded, sinking back into her thoughts. Are you going to be okay? The detective asked, rising. No, Tom answered honestly. But we'll be fine. We don't have a choice. As they left the Miller house, Detective Parker stopped in front of his car and looked out onto quiet Maple Street. Outside the windows of the neighboring houses glimpsed silhouettes of people living ordinary lives, families having dinner, children laughing, couples watching the evening news. They were unaware of the tragedy playing out next to them, how an ordinary family, mother, father, daughter, had been shattered by passion, deceit, and despair, how secrets and lies led to murder and broken hearts. The detective got into his car and started the engine. Tomorrow would be a new day, new crimes, new victims. But today would be forever etched in Tom and Kate Miller's memories, the day the truth came out and shattered their world.